Hello and welcome to my review of Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs for my final project in my film class. Uh, Reservoir Dogs was one of Quentin Tarantino's first films as an independent filmmaker and features a band of criminals talking about what happened and what exactly went wrong during their diamond heist. Within it, we see a lot of interesting cinematography shots being used to help emphasize elements of the story, such mainly involving like power and like where it resides between the different characters. We see this a lot with scenes featuring Mr. Orange, who, in spoiler alerts, is shot, and for most of the movie is bleeding mostly on the floor. And almost every one of these shots that features him, it is a downward angle showing kind of like his weakness and his kind of inevitability of death as he is dying from a bullet wound. And all shots surrounding him mostly are looking up toward other people who are looking down on him. So it's like looking up to Mr. White, who is taking care of him and is making sure that he's okay, and then looking up to his fellow police officer as he's an undercover cop. These shots are also kind of featured with other characters throughout the film. Like another example would be Mr. White and Joe, who with Mr. White is sitting down in the chair looking up at Joe, who's kind of like a superior, and then Joe, who is ultimately the boss, is looking down at Mr. White. Um, Beyond this, we also see other interesting uses of panning with shots, where casual shots and casual conversations are kind of in like a panning motion mostly. Like for example, the breakfast scene, and the scene where they're all together planning. Usually, in scenes like this where they're all together, this panning is kind of used. Otherwise, with individual characters, it's kind of done with like a wider angle shot, so you just kind of see vaguely what's kind of going on because nothing's really important. So it's just giving you a general picture, and I think that's like the message meant to be shown here. But with this kind of sweeping angle, it's kind of like showing everyone and what's going on, or with this wider angle, just showing everyone and kind of like you see a general of what's going on. But when things get more serious, or like someone's making a statement, such as like with the breakfast scene with Mr. Pink's monologue on why he doesn't tip, or Joe talking to people about like what they need to be doing, or Mr. White like talking about like what the heist might entail. We see that it kind of freezes on them, and usually like a medium shot or kind of almost a close up of their face as they talk. And then usually between conversations between individual characters, usually it's a close up to a close up to a close up like juxtaposition, while usually it's kind of brought back for more general, almost like whatever kind of shots. Also in the film, we see like I see some fairly basic lighting use and some pretty basic sound where there's not a whole lot of music, for example, that's played, and the only music that's really played is like stuff that actually comes like diegetic music that's actually like coming from a radio source that's like just around. And usually I find it's used sometimes ironically, like specifically like with the torture scene. They're just kind of like with Mr. Blonde putting on like the greatest hits of the 70s. He kind of like just puts it on and then he just like all these horrendous things. It's just kind of interesting to see how they do that. But it's like they emphasize how like it is within the how it is within like the actual world itself, because like he'll like leave to go get like that cask of gasoline and like the music will fade into the background and eventually stop, and then he'll come back and it's still playing because it's coming from the radio. um the narrative also is pretty interesting because we see that you can almost predict who will die and who will make it out in the end, which once again, more spoilers, only Mr. Pink makes it out alive. But we see that every other character, there's almost like a reason pointing to why they died. um every one of the members of the team, we can kind of like point to one factor. For example, with Mr. Brown, he's kind of like a cocky, naive. He's kind of inappropriate, like shown at the dinner table. So maybe you can assume that he's pretty new at this. So because he's pretty new, maybe he's inexperienced, and that's why he ends up kind of getting shot in the head or just bad luck. With Mr. Blue, he's kind of an older gentleman, perhaps not quite as suited for this work anymore. With Mr. Orange, he's an undercover cop, so he's kind of got like a weakness going on or something else he has to focus on. Mr. White, he's overly concerning over Mr. Orange, who he fully believes is not an undercover cop, but is in fact an undercover cop. Mr. Blonde is kind of crazy. And Joe and his son Eddie are kind of almost dysfunctional and kind of too serious at what they do in their job. Like with Eddie just shooting the cop right away, like, oh, no big deal, and kind of a bit too serious. But also we see like their interactions are a bit jokey. Like when they're in the car after picking up Orange and Orange's flashback, it's very almost too relaxed. But then we see with Mr. Pink, the only one who actually makes it out alive, he's constantly saying like he is a professional. He is doing his job because he is a professional. He's doing professional work. We need to consider what we should be doing. You know, he's always focused on the job rather than like individual little things that are going on. And he's ultimately the one who hides himself away and is able to actually get out in the end with the diamonds, and while everyone else is killed. And I always thought that was kind of interesting. We also see that again, with these with the movie, we see a lot of violence, and with this violence, we kind of see that it's very glorified, which is something that we would come to expect with a Tarantino movie. Granted, this is his first. This is kind of like a demonstration of what would come in every one of his movies. That it is a very violent movie, but the violence is almost like done casually in the same way mentioned before, with how like wider angle views are used for like more casual conversations where like details aren't really necessary. We see this with a lot of violence in the movie. So, for example, like when Eddie shoots the cop, or like when Eddie, Joe, and Mr. White are in a shoot off and eventually shoot all of each other. These are all done in wide angle shots, so we can see what's going on. Everything is able to, like, we can see if someone's getting shot, if someone's getting tortured for the most part. Although with the torturing scenes, we don't see the ear getting cut off, which could be like a special effects type thing where they couldn't quite do it, or maybe it's because they were supposed to emphasize it's a different, more evil kind of violence, so that's not even worth being shown. I'm not sure. But that's like what I would point it toward. But yeah, all the and all the violence is very like emphasized, like, and also like all the blood is very visible and very red for the most part. So obviously, like as Mr. Orange is bleeding out, his blood is going everywhere and it's all up and down his shirt. But with Mr. Blonde, he immediately has all this red all up and down his shirt. Eddie has blood on his face after he shoots the cop. The cop is covered in blood after being beaten up. Like this color of red and like the violence are tied together in some way like that, where it's like all like the blood is very like drawing your eye to like showing like this like that is happening, I guess, and it's very like an emphasis on the violence almost, which I guess we all know is in Tarantino movies because they're always very violent. In the end, though, this movie was really good. Definitely worth a watch, even for like Tarantino's like first kind of shot at making a movie. It's a really good film for what it is, and it's a really good like insight to like what eventually will be further Tarantino movies. Thanks for listening to this review, and I will see you all later, I guess.